Now, very often when we talk about African history, there is almost an exclusive focus on the fact that Africans were made into slaves. Okay? I'm going to say something about that. I'm going to talk about it. The only thing people will know about Africa often, especially if they, sort of African Americans, is the fact that slaves came from Africa. Now, I want us to take this apart and to look at this phenomenon also, okay? Because around 1800, the slave trade was still alive and well. There was still extensive slavery, okay? And there's two dimensions to this trade, at least. There's the trade on the continent. Don't think that Africans didn't enslave Africans, okay? That there were no people in bondage on the continent, and that it was all external. How did the external forces get slaves in the first place? They were sold. People sold people, okay? Now we must look at the dynamics. Why did it happen? In which societies, in which parts of the continent more than others? Also, the term slavery, quote unquote, is a very complicated term. It can't describe the whole range of experiences and types of bondage. Okay, so slavery is a broad term, but in fact, the way in which people were unfree was very diverse. Okay, so you think only of the American South and people on plantations. That wasn't the case for many people in Africa. People were enslaved, but in a household. In most cases, in smaller numbers. People were enslaved. They were slaves, but they carried weapons. Okay, they were soldiers. They were recruited. They were enslaved. They were captured, and they became soldiers. And they even joined the royal household, and they were better off than those in other households. So
house Negroes.
Huh?
House Negroes.
No, that's it. But let's. So it's a fascinating topic. It's, for instance, the slaves that were taken out of the continent on the Atlantic coast. Most of them were men. 2/3 of the slaves who went to the Americas were men. The slaves internally were mostly women. Okay, but again, don't have a single image of it, bound by the hands and the feet and so on. The relations were very, very different. It often had nothing to do with being bound up, and it often meant that a master would have obligations to treat a slave in a certain way, because his honor and his name amongst his peers was in question if he didn't treat a slave in a certain way. When I taught in America, my impression was often that, especially the African Americans, the black Americans, were so concerned only to hear about the slave trade. Okay, and because it's part of their heritage, that's where they. But that is not for me. Sorry, Comrade Al. That is not for me the only feature of African history. The other point is that I know of no cultural area or land surface or geographical area in the world that didn't have some form of bondage. Okay, so that it is not unique to Christianity or Islam or Jews or Judaism, or you have to ask the economic question: what necessitated the need for the mobilization of unfree labor? And sometimes the so-called liberation of a slave was not much of a liberation in any case. It became what Marx called wage slavery. Basically, you freed somebody, quote unquote, to earn a low wage as another form of slavery. Now, since we're talking about that area, let's just now talk about the slave trade quickly. The Spanish make the encounter with the Americas, okay, from 1892. The Portuguese, by that time, were already interested in the coastal area, Morocco, south of Morocco. It's not very far. So they were rounding that area, and they were attempting to penetrate it, and already taking captives and so on. When the Spanish under Columbus set foot in the Americas, and over the next few decades begin to wipe out and to push back, destroy the indigenous people, what we call the Indians, the American Indians. And they begin to see the opportunities. They need labor. The one element in slavery as a labor system, I want you to think of it as a labor system. The one thing to remember is it is not a good idea to employ or to enslave the local people. Why not? Because a local person knows the terrain better than you. So and is more than you. So you either kill the locals or push them back, but you don't enslave them because they're more than you, they can overpower you, and they know the terrain better, they're just going to run away. So you always bring slaves from elsewhere. That's what happened in the Cape also. That's how people like ancestors of my own were brought from India and Indonesia and from West Africa and so on to the Cape, because Van Riebeeck was ordered not to enslave the locals. Even if Europe discovered himself, it's pointless because they know the terrain. And they're more than you. You have some relationship with them. You either wipe them out over time, or you negotiate and you make friends and then you overpower them. So in the Americas too, they destroyed the local populations, and then they had to find a source of labor, and the source of labor would be Africa, the west coast of Africa. And so the Portuguese, which had begun from before the discovery of the Americas already, to make contacts, to take people as slaves to Europe. Remember, Europe also had slavery on the mainland, okay? Yeah. Slavery was abolished over time in Europe also as well. And there were other forms of bondage, of serfdom and so on, which approximated to slavery, but there was also just simply slavery. So they moved around the coast of Africa, right as far as Angola, and maybe even northern Namibia. And those areas, they established along the coast what we call factories or posts, and began to engage in exchanges for the human commodity. There were all sorts of exchanges for all sorts of things. But you know, by the 1700s, just before our 1800s, by the 1700s, which was the high point, about 80,000 trips were made annually to take people. And as I said, mainly men.
80,000.
So, why did they take them? Because they discovered, firstly, in the West Indies, in the islands, where they easily wiped out the local people, the Arawaks, the indigenous people. The Caribbean was emptied of local people, and they established plantations, and plantations needed huge numbers of labor. And what kind of plantations? This was the beginning of the mass production of sugar. Sugar in the West Indies. And they took, why in the 1700s it became so big? Because they established even bigger plantations in Brazil. And so the bulk of the slaves would come from the area around Angola and taken to Brazil.
By who?
By who? By who? Very interesting question. By who? It was an international trade. So it was an international trade in which Portuguese, English, Danish, French, all sorts of European companies and countries traded from the coast and took people. Okay, any company, the Dutch, it was a multinational setup of companies taking people. Now, what happened? They brought people at the coast. They brought people at the coast, but people were brought to the coast from the interior by the local chiefs, the local royalty.
And by those warriors or the soldiers of the particular kingdom.
Yes, exactly. So they would, and it wasn't a case, it's black on black violence or it's African. It was people. Most of the time, it was out of war, and sometimes they produced a war or they consciously went into a war situation, and these were the victims of the war. The victims of the war, and then they were shipped off. They're your enemies. So basically, it was states enslaving the enemies and then taking them to the coast and shipping them out. East Africa, so there was also a trade on the East African coast. Okay, so that also went to the Americas, but also went out of the into the East. And there was also a trade across the Sahara, okay, and across the Red Sea. So there were trades from all parts of the continent. Now, I have to finish here. We can continue. I can continue with the other parts of it when I start next week. The important thing to remember is that this, though, does not define African history. It is an important element in African history. When one does history, one has to firstly ask, what are the sources? Where do I get my evidence? I'm saying this. I said 80,000 trips out of the continent per annum. Where did I get that from? Did I make it up? No. Some historians had looked at the economic history of the trade, looked at the companies involved, and this counted up massive data. So they've taken collectively all the companies' records from all the countries. These are massive teams of researchers that have what we call number crunched, put all the data in and put out this. So now the question is, how many slaves, how many people were forced out of Africa? There's a big debate going on. Some scholars say 23 million over the period from from 1500 to the end of the slave trade. Another figure is 11 to 12 million. That's the sort of dominant figure at the moment, that 11 to 12 million were taken out of the continent in the Atlantic slave trade, and only 9 million arrived at the other side because there was death in the, what this is called the Middle Passage, the passage across the sea.